December 19th, 1944, Verdun, France. 16 senior Allied commanders sat in a freezing room. The Battle of the Bulge raged 50 miles north, the largest battle ever fought by the US Army. The 101st Airborne was surrounded at Bastogne. Eisenhower asked the question that mattered. How soon can you attack? Montgomery said 1 week, others said 10 days. Patton stood up. I can attack with 3 divisions in 48 hours. The room went silent. Bradley stared at his old friend, thinking he'd lost his mind. It was impossible. Patton's entire Third Army was facing east, attacking into Germany. To reach Bastogne meant turning 250,000 men 90 degrees in the worst winter in decades and attacking uphill into the teeth of German armour. Several commanders laughed. British officers rolled their eyes. Even Bradley was sceptical. But on December the 26th, 7 days later, Patton's tanks smashed through to Bastogne, and Bradley said something he'd remember the rest of his life. This is the story of what happened when one general promised the impossible and then delivered. First, you'll discover what made Bradley, Patton's oldest friend, doubt whether he could actually pull it off, and why that doubt was entirely justified given what Third Army was being asked to do. Then you'll hear how 250,000 soldiers executed one of the most remarkable military maneuvers in American history, turning an entire army 90 degrees in 3 days whilst maintaining combat effectiveness in brutal winter conditions. And finally, you'll understand why Bradley later called it the most brilliant operation of the war, and what that meant, coming from a man who'd witnessed every major campaign from Normandy to the German border. This isn't a story about armies moving on maps. It's about what happens when aggressive leadership, experienced soldiers, and desperate circumstances collide. Let me take you back to the night of December 18th, 1944. Lieutenant General Omar Nelson Bradley sat in his 12th Army Group headquarters in Luxembourg City, studying reconnaissance reports with growing alarm. For 2 days, German forces had been pouring through the Ardennes forest, the supposedly impenetrable terrain where Allied intelligence had assured him no major offensive could occur. Those assurances were now revealed as catastrophically wrong. The scope was staggering. Over 200,000 German troops, supported by nearly 1,000 tanks, had smashed into the thinly held American lines. Units were scattered, communications disrupted. Some American divisions had simply disintegrated under the onslaught. Bradley picked up the phone and called Lieutenant General George Smith Patton Jr., commanding Third Army to the south. Brad, I've got a bridgehead across the Saar, Patton began enthusiastically. I'm on my way into Germany. Third Army had been hammering at German defenses for weeks, finally achieving breakthrough. Patton was preparing to exploit success with the kind of rapid armoured thrust that had made him famous across France in August. Wait a minute, George, Bradley interrupted. There's a lot of trouble up north. He explained the situation, a massive German offensive, entire divisions overrun by the front collapsing. Bradley needed Patton to send his 10th Armoured Division north immediately. Patton objected. Without the 10th Armoured, he couldn't exploit his breakthrough at Saarbrücken. Everything Third Army had fought for over the past month would be wasted. But Bradley was insistent. Eisenhower wanted all senior commanders at Verdun the next morning for an emergency conference. After hanging up, Patton did something that would prove decisive. Despite his frustration, he recognized the German offensive might be more than a spoiling attack. He called in his staff. The Germans have launched a major offensive through the Ardennes, he told them. Eisenhower wants us at Verdun tomorrow morning. I suspect we're going to be ordered to turn north and attack into the German flank. His staff officers exchanged glances. Turn north? The entire Third Army was oriented east and south. Turning 90 degrees whilst maintaining combat effectiveness would be extraordinarily difficult. Start planning, Patton ordered. I want 3 plans. First, an attack north with 3 divisions. Second, an attack with 4 divisions. Third, an attack with 6 divisions. Have them ready by morning. His staff thought he was being optimistic. Surely Eisenhower wouldn't order such a massive reorientation so quickly. But Patton understood something his peers often missed. In mobile warfare, tempo matters more than perfect preparation. Throughout that night, Third Army staff officers worked frantically. They studied maps, plotted road networks, calculated fuel requirements, drafted movement orders. The logistics were staggering, moving hundreds of thousands of soldiers, tens of thousands of vehicles, and mountains of supplies 90 degrees in winter conditions seemed almost impossible. Bradley, meanwhile, was confronting his own crisis of confidence. As 12th Army Group Commander, responsibility for the Ardennes sector fell ultimately on him. He had accepted intelligence assessments that deemed the area unsuitable for major German operations. He had positioned inexperienced divisions there, believing it a quiet sector where green troops could gain combat experience safely. Those decisions now looked catastrophically wrong. You've just heard how Patton spent the night planning for something he hadn't even been ordered to do yet. How he anticipated what would be asked and prepared accordingly, whilst his peers slept. If you're the kind of person who wants to understand military leadership at this level, the kind that anticipates crisis and plans 3 moves ahead, then you're exactly who we make these videos for. Every week, we dig into the decisions that shaped history, the moments where leadership mattered more than resources. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Now let me tell you what happened when those 16 commanders sat down in that freezing room. December 19th, 1944, 11 o'clock a.m. The conference room in Verdun's Caserne Maginot was freezing. 16 senior Allied commanders sat bundled in heavy coats, their breath visible in the cold air. Supreme Commander General Dwight David Eisenhower called the meeting to order with characteristic directness. The present situation is to be regarded as one of opportunity for us and not of disaster. The statement seemed absurd. German forces had driven a massive bulge into Allied lines, hence the battle's eventual name. American casualties were mounting by the hour. Communications remained chaotic. But Eisenhower's strategic instinct was sound. The German offensive had pulled their reserves out of defensive positions. If Allied forces could blunt the advance and counterattack, they might trap and destroy significant German forces. He outlined the situation. The town of Bastogne, a crossroads where 7 major roads converged, was critical to German plans. The 101st Airborne Division, rushed from reserve, had reached Bastogne just hours before German forces surrounded it. Now the paratroopers were besieged. "We must hold Bastogne," Eisenhower declared. The Germans neared the roads. Denying them Bastogne would slow their entire offensive, but holding meant relieving the surrounded garrison before they ran out of ammunition, food, and medical supplies. Eisenhower turned to Patton. "George, how soon can you attack north with a substantial force?" What happened next entered military legend. Patton stood and walked to the situation map. "I can attack with 3 divisions on December 22nd, he stated flatly. 48 hours from now." The room erupted. Several commanders laughed, thinking Patton was joking or grandstanding. British officers rolled their eyes. Classic American bravado. Even Bradley was skeptical. He knew Patton's tendency towards optimistic predictions and aggressive rhetoric. "When can you start?" Eisenhower pressed, wanting a realistic assessment. "The morning of December 22nd, Patton repeated, with 3 divisions, the 4th Armoured, the 26th Infantry, and the 80th Infantry. Bradley's Chief of Staff leaned over and whispered, "He's bluffing. There's no way." But Patton wasn't bluffing. Whilst his staff had worked through the night preparing contingency plans, Patton had already made his decision. He would execute the 3-division attack plan, 4th Armoured Division leading as the spearhead, with 2 infantry divisions providing flank support. The objective, drive north from the island area, break through German lines south of Bastogne, and relieve the 101st Airborne. Bradley knew Patton well enough to recognize he was serious. They had been friends since West Point, had served together for decades. Patton didn't make promises he couldn't keep, not in combat operations. But even knowing Patton's capabilities, Bradley found the timeline almost impossible to believe. "That's a tall order, George," Bradley said carefully. Patton's response was characteristic. "We'll do it. My staff already has movement orders prepared. Units are standing by for execution. We'll attack on the 22nd. Montgomery, commanding 21st Army Group north of the Bulge, stated he could launch his counter-offensive, not before January 1st. He needed time to properly organize, mass forces, ensure adequate supplies. This methodical approach was typical Montgomery. Thorough, careful, reluctant to attack before everything was perfect. The contrast couldn't have been more stark. Montgomery needed 2 weeks. Patton promised 48 hours. Eisenhower made his decision. Patton would attack south of the Bulge on December 22nd. Montgomery would organize the northern counter-offensive for early January. As the conference broke up, Bradley pulled Patton aside. "George, you'd better deliver on this. The whole Allied command structure just heard you promise the impossible." Patton's reply was simple. "I'll be in Bastogne by Christmas." December 19th to 21st, 1944. What followed was one of the most remarkable military maneuvers in American history. Third Army had approximately 250,000 soldiers, over 130,000 vehicles, and was actively engaged in combat operations against German forces to the east and south. Now it had to disengage, pivot 90 degrees and attack northward, all whilst maintaining combat effectiveness in the worst winter weather in 38 years. The logistics were staggering. Roads in the region were narrow, icy, and packed with military traffic moving in multiple directions. Fuel lorries had to navigate the same routes as combat units. Artillery battalions needed to relocate from firing positions in the Saar to new positions facing north. Communications networks had to be completely reconfigured. Supply dumps established for eastward operations had to be abandoned or relocated. Patton's staff worked around the clock. Movement orders went out to every division, regiment, battalion. Engineers prepared routes, marking them with signs to prevent units from getting lost in the confusion. Military police were positioned at critical intersections to direct traffic. Fuel dumps were established along the routes to keep vehicles moving. The weather was brutal. Temperatures plunged below freezing. Snow mixed with freezing rain created treacherous road conditions. Soldiers who had been fighting in relatively dry conditions to the south now faced the full fury of the Ardennes winter. Vehicles broke down from the cold. Frostbite and trench foot became immediate concerns. But Patton's reputation for strict discipline and intensive training paid dividends. Third Army units executed their movement orders with remarkable efficiency. Unit commanders understood that speed mattered more than perfect positioning. Getting forces into action quickly was better than waiting to arrange everything ideally. The 4th Armoured Division, selected as the spearhead, began moving north on December 19th. This battle-hardened formation had fought across France since the Normandy breakout. Its soldiers were experienced, its leaders competent, its equipment well-maintained. But even the 4th Armoured had never attempted anything like this, moving over 100 miles in winter conditions, then immediately attacking into prepared German defences. The 26th Infantry Division, commanded by Major General Willard Pohl, followed. This division had seen heavy fighting in Lorraine and had suffered significant casualties. But its soldiers were tough and determined. Behind them came the 80th Infantry Division under Major General Horace McBride, another experienced formation that had earned Patton's respect through hard fighting. By December 21st, all 3 divisions were in position south of Bastogne. They had covered distances that ranged from 75 to over 150 miles, depending on starting positions. The movement had been executed in 48 to 72 hours, exactly as Patton promised. Bradley, watching from 12th Army Group headquarters, was amazed. He had doubted whether Patton could deliver on his promise. Now 3rd Army forces were positioned to attack on schedule, despite challenges that should have made the operation impossible. On December the 22nd, Patton's forces attacked northward. The 4th Armoured Division led the assault, driving towards Bastogne through heavily defended German positions. The fighting was immediately fierce. German forces, surprised by the speed of American response, had nonetheless positioned strong defenses south of Bastogne. They recognized that relieving the besieged garrison would undermine their entire offensive. Weather continued to hamper operations. Fog, snow, and overcast conditions prevented air support. Artillery struggled to maintain fire support whilst displacing forward. Infantry advanced through frozen forests where German defenders had prepared ambush positions. Tank battles erupted on icy roads where maneuver was nearly impossible. Progress was measured in hundreds of yards, sometimes less. Villages became fortresses where every building required clearing. German counterattacks struck American flanks, casualties mounted. But Third Army forces maintained offensive momentum. They didn't pause to consolidate or reorganize. They attacked, advanced, attacked again. You know what's remarkable about this moment? Most people learn about the Battle of the Bulge as a defensive victory, American soldiers holding out against German attack. But you're still here, which tells me you're someone who actually cares about understanding the offensive operation that broke the siege. The maneuver that military historians still study as a masterclass in operational flexibility. That's exactly why this channel exists. We're building a community that refuses to accept simplified versions of complex military operations. If that sounds like something you want to be part of, subscribe. Now let me tell you what was happening inside Bastogne whilst Patton's forces ground northward. December 22nd to 26th, 1944. Inside Bastogne, the situation grew increasingly desperate. Brigadier General Anthony Clement McAuliffe, acting commander of the 101st Airborne Division, maintained morale through sheer force of personality and the paratroopers' own toughness. When German commanders sent a surrender ultimatum on December 22nd, McAuliffe's one-word response became legendary: nuts. But legendary responses didn't solve the garrison's fundamental problems. Dwindling ammunition, scarce medical supplies, wounded soldiers in need of evacuation. On December 23rd, weather finally cleared. Allied air power, grounded for days by fog and overcast conditions, struck German positions with devastating effect. Hundreds of C-47 transport aircraft dropped supplies to the Bastogne garrison. Paratroopers rushed to retrieve containers of ammunition, rations, and medical supplies. Spirits soared. They weren't abandoned. But relief still depended on Patton's advance. South of Bastogne, the 4th Armoured Division ground forward against stubborn German resistance. The division was organized into 3 combat commands, small flexible task forces combining tanks, infantry, and artillery. Combat Command B, led by Lieutenant Colonel Crichton Williams, Abrams Jr., spearheaded the main thrust. Abrams was a tanker's tanker. Aggressive, skilled, fearless. His soldiers trusted him completely. On December 26th, Abrams received orders to break through to Bastogne regardless of cost. He organized a task force around Company C of the 37th Tank Battalion and elements of the 53rd Armored Infantry Battalion. The objective: drive straight up the road from Ardennes to Bastogne, approximately 4 miles through whatever German forces stood in the way. The attack began at 3:00 p.m. Sherman tanks, infantry half-tracks, and supporting vehicles charged up the road in a column. German forces, caught by surprise at the audacity of the assault, responded with anti-tank fire and small arms. American tanks fired on the move, suppressing German positions. Infantry cleared houses and strongpoints. The column kept moving. At 4:50 p.m., Lieutenant Charles Bulge, commanding the lead tank Cobra King, approached Bastogne's perimeter. He stood in his turret hatch, waving an orange identification panel. Soldiers of the 326th Airborne Engineer Battalion, manning positions on the perimeter, recognized American tanks approaching from the south. They had been relieved. News spread instantly through Bastogne. The 101st Airborne, besieged for 7 days, was no longer cut off. Within hours, supply convoys began entering the town. Wounded soldiers were evacuated. Fresh ammunition arrived. The relief had succeeded. We've just seen how Patton delivered on his promise, how Third Army turned 90 degrees in 3 days and broke through to Bastogne in 7. But this story doesn't end with the relief. Because what Bradley said about Patton's achievement and why he said it reveals something profound about military leadership and the relationship between these 2 old friends. Stay with me. When Bradley received confirmation that Patton's forces had broken through to Bastogne, his reaction was complex. Pride in American soldiers' achievement mixed with relief that the risky operation had succeeded, but also amazement at what Patton had accomplished. In 7 days, not the 48 hours promised for the attack to begin, but an astonishingly short time nonetheless, Patton had turned an entire army, fought through prepared German defences, and relieved a besieged garrison that many had feared would be overrun. Bradley called Patton personally. The conversation was brief. "George, congratulations, you did it." Patton's response was characteristic. "The 101st didn't need rescuing. They were doing fine. We just opened the door so they could continue the fight." This exchange captured the complex relationship between the 101st Airborne and Patton's relief force. Paratroopers bristled at suggestions they'd been rescued. They had held Bastogne against overwhelming odds, repelled multiple German assaults, and maintained combat effectiveness throughout the siege. McAuliffe's nuts response embodied their defiant spirit. But practical reality was undeniable. Without Patton's relief, the garrison would eventually have been overrun or forced to surrender. Ammunition was nearly exhausted. Medical supplies were critically low. German forces surrounding the town outnumbered defenders significantly. The siege could not have continued indefinitely. The relief of Bastogne didn't end the battle. For 3 more weeks, fierce fighting raged around the town as German forces attempted to recapture it, and Allied forces worked to eliminate the entire Bulge. But the symbolic and strategic significance of Bastogne's relief was immediate and profound. Bradley's assessment of Patton's achievement evolved in the days following the breakthrough. In his personal notes and later in his memoirs, Bradley reflected on what Third Army had accomplished. His comments revealed both professional military judgment and personal understanding of Patton's unique capabilities. "George did it better and faster than I had any right to expect," Bradley wrote. This was high praise from a commander known for understated expression. Bradley recognized that Patton's 48-hour promise referred to launching the attack, not completing the relief. But even accounting for that distinction, the speed of Third Army's response was remarkable. What impressed Bradley most wasn't just the rapidity of movement, but the combat effectiveness maintained throughout the operation. Third Army didn't simply rush north in disorder. It executed a coordinated maneuver that maintained unit cohesion, preserved command and control, and delivered forces ready to fight immediately upon arrival. This required exceptional staff work, experienced leadership, and well-trained soldiers. Bradley also recognized the operational risk Patton had accepted. By committing 3 divisions to the Bastogne relief, Third Army had weakened its positions facing east and south. German forces could have counterattacked into Third Army's exposed flanks. Supply lines were stretched dangerously thin. If the relief had failed, or if German forces had launched successful counterattacks elsewhere, Patton would have faced severe criticism. But Patton had calculated correctly that speed mattered more than perfect security. In mobile warfare, tempo and initiative often trump caution. By attacking quickly, Third Army seized the initiative from German forces still focused on their westward advance. The psychological impact alone was significant. German commanders had to divert attention and resources to counter Third Army's thrust, weakening their main effort. On January 14, 1945, General Eisenhower visited Bastogne to award decorations to soldiers who had defended the town. Among the recipients was Brigadier General McAuliffe, who received the Distinguished Service Cross. Patton attended the ceremony, as did Bradley. Photographers captured the moment. Patton pinning medals on paratroopers, shaking hands with McAuliffe, inspecting the shattered town. After the ceremony, Bradley pulled Patton aside. Their conversation was private, but Patton recorded in his diary Bradley's comments. "Brad told me the Third Army's response at Bastogne was the most brilliant operation of the war. He said historians would study it for generations." This was extraordinary praise from Bradley, who was not given to hyperbole. As 12th Army Group Commander, he had oversight of all American ground operations in Europe. He had witnessed every major campaign from Normandy to the German border. For him to call Bastogne the most brilliant operation of the war reflected genuine professional admiration. Bradley's public statements were more measured but equally complimentary. In press conferences, he emphasized Third Army's achievement as demonstrating American soldiers' capability for rapid response and sustained offensive operations in difficult conditions. He praised not just Patton, but the entire Third Army, commanders, staff officers, and especially the soldiers who had executed the operation under brutal conditions. Years later, after the war ended, Bradley reflected more philosophically on Patton's Bastogne relief. In his memoir, A Soldier's Story, he wrote, "Patton's finest hour, perhaps, came in that brilliant response to the German breakthrough in the Bulge. He turned a whole army on a dime, drove it through terrible weather into desperate combat, and delivered precisely what he promised." The relationship between Bradley and Patton was complex. Old friends, professional rivals, commanders with very different styles. Bradley was methodical, careful, diplomatic. Patton was aggressive, impulsive, often tactless. But at Bastogne, Patton's unique qualities produced results that vindicated Bradley's decision to keep him in command despite repeated controversies. Let me tell you, what makes Bradley's assessment so significant. These two men had known each other for over 30 years. They'd been cadets together at West Point, served in the same units, watched each other's careers develop through peacetime and war. Bradley had seen Patton at his best and his worst. He'd witnessed Patton's tactical brilliance during the breakout from Normandy in August 1944, when Third Army had raced across France, covering hundreds of miles in weeks, liberating Paris and reaching the German border before supply lines forced a halt. But Bradley had also dealt with Patton's worst moments. The slapping incidents in Sicily in 1943, when Patton had struck two soldiers suffering from battle fatigue. The incidents had nearly ended Patton's career. Eisenhower had relieved him from command and sent him into exile. Bradley had been there through all of it. He'd defended Patton when others wanted him court-martialed. He'd argued that Patton's tactical genius outweighed his personal flaws. He'd kept faith that Patton could be controlled, channeled, used effectively despite his volatile personality. Bastogne vindicated that faith completely because what Patton accomplished wasn't just tactically brilliant, it was operationally decisive. The speed of Third Army's response prevented the German offensive from achieving its objectives by relieving Bastogne in 7 days, instead of the 2 weeks Montgomery needed to prepare his counter-offensive. Patton denied German forces the road network they required to continue their advance. The psychological impact was equally important. German commanders had calculated that American forces would need at least 10 days to respond effectively. Patton's 48-hour promise seemed like bravado, until it wasn't. When Third Army attacked on December 22nd, exactly when Patton said it would, German forces realized they'd miscalculated American capabilities, but the crushing weight of American industrial might, combined with aggressive leadership and adaptable soldiers, created a force that could execute operational maneuvers German commanders thought impossible. Bradley understood all of this. He understood that Patton hadn't just moved an army quickly, he demonstrated that American forces could match German operational flexibility, that they could execute complex maneuvers under brutal conditions, that they possessed the leadership, training, and logistics to sustain offensive operations, even when circumstances suggested caution. And he understood something more personal, that his old friend, controversial and difficult though he was, had delivered when it mattered most. That the promise made in that freezing room in Verdun wasn't bravado. It was commitment backed by planning, leadership, and sheer force of will. The most brilliant operation of the war. Coming from Bradley, who'd commanded hundreds of thousands of soldiers through Normandy, the breakout, the race across France, the bloody fighting in the Hürtgen forest and along the German border. Those words meant everything. The 101st Airborne's defense of Bastogne and Third Army's relief operation became one of the war's most celebrated episodes. It demonstrated American resilience, tactical flexibility, and the importance of aggressive leadership. For Bradley, it validated his faith in Patton's combat effectiveness despite all the controversies, all the difficulties, all the moments when keeping Patton in command seemed more trouble than it was worth. For Patton, it was redemption. Proof that his methods worked, that his aggressive style, his insistence on speed over caution, his willingness to take operational risks, all of it produced results when circumstances demanded bold action. For the soldiers of both forces, it was proof they could match and defeat Germany's best troops in the hardest conditions. But here's what this story really reveals about military leadership. Sometimes the most important thing a commander can do is promise the impossible, then deliver. Not because they're certain they can do it, Patton wasn't certain. The logistics were genuinely staggering. The weather was genuinely brutal. The operational challenges were genuinely unprecedented. But he promised anyway. Because he understood that in crisis, boldness matters more than caution, that decisive action beats perfect planning, that committing to a timeline forces everyone, staff officers, unit commanders, individual soldiers, to find solutions rather than identify obstacles. Bradley recognized this. That's why he called it the most brilliant operation of the war. Not just because of what was accomplished, but because of what it represented. Leadership that refuses to accept that something can't be done simply because it's never been done before. Sometimes you turn an entire army 90 degrees in the worst winter in decades because the alternative is letting a surrounded garrison be overrun. Sometimes you attack in 48 hours because waiting a week means the enemy consolidates their positions and your window closes. Sometimes you promise the impossible because keeping that promise is the only way to save thousands of lives. And sometimes your oldest friend, the man who's known you for 30 years, who's seen your flaws and defended your brilliance, looks at what you have accomplished and says, historians will study this for generations. If you made it this far, thank you. Seriously. Videos like this take weeks to research and produce, and they only exist because people like you actually watch them all the way through. If you want more stories like this, stories that show how leadership, planning, and execution combine to achieve what seems impossible, then subscribe. And if you really want to help these stories reach more people, share this video. These soldiers delivered the impossible. The least we can do is remember them properly. I'll see you in the next one.